There is a kind of quiet that only settles at the very end of a life, and Vale had come to know it the way a sailor knows a coast he will never make port upon. It lived in the corners of the small white room. It lived in the low hum of the machines that kept a stubborn account of his failing, and in the careful footsteps of the women who came to turn him, to wet his lips, to speak to him in the soft register people reserve for the dying, as if loudness might tip him over an edge he was already falling past. He had been falling for a long time, long enough that the falling had become ordinary. The illness had taken his strength first, then his appetite, then the use of his hands, until all that remained to him was the window, and beyond it, a narrow slice of grey autumn sky where, on the good days, birds crossed. He watched them the way a starving man watches bread through glass. He had never in his life so wanted a thing he could not have as he wanted to walk out under that sky, once, on his own 2 feet, and feel the cold air fill lungs that worked. He had lost people before this, a mother, early, a wife, and with her the child that had never drawn breath, a grief so old now that it had worn smooth, a stone carried so long he no longer felt its edges, only its weight. He had spent the years after learning to be gentle with strangers, because he had learned, the hard way, how little it cost and how much it mattered. He had not been an important man. No one would build monuments. But he had sat with the frightened and held the hands of the abandoned. And if a life could be weighed by such small mercies, then his had not been empty. Now the weighing had come. He felt it arrive not as pain. The pain had, mercifully, thinned to a distant tide, but as a loosening, a sense of the room drawing back from him like water down a beach. The birds at the window blurred. A woman's voice said his name, and the name seemed to belong to someone standing very far away. And then the room was gone, and there was no falling anymore, because there was nowhere left to fall. He hung in a stillness that was not dark and not light. He had no body to feel the absence of, and yet he felt himself, entire, as though he had been poured out of the vessel that had failed him, and now stood as pure attention in a vast and patient place. "You have reached the measure of your thread," said a voice. It was not unkind, neither was it kind. It had the evenness of a scale coming to rest, of a tally struck true, and though it used no mouth and no air, Vale understood it as clearly as speech. "I am the loom," it said, when he reached for understanding. "I am the awareness in which all living things are counted and measured and known. You are ended in the world that made you. That thread is cut. What remains to you now is a small choice, and then either passage or nothing at all." "Passage where?" Vale asked, and was surprised to find he could. "Into a world beneath my counting," the voice said. "A world of kindreds and callings, of growth measured and rewarded, of gods that walk and folk that were not born of any womb. You would enter it a crossing, one called over from elsewhere. This is rarely offered. It is offered to you because of a peculiarity in the shape of you, a thing I will not name yet, that makes your thread worth the counting. And if I refuse, then you are nothing, and the counting is done, and there is peace in that too." He thought, because thinking was, it seemed, the one thing he had brought with him whole, of the birds crossing the window, of the cold air he had wanted so badly to breathe, of hands he might yet hold. "I would go," he said. Something shifted in the stillness, an unfolding, as of a great work opening to show its threads. "It is customary," the loom said, "for one who crosses to first mend a single soul left behind, one kindred of the destination, chosen and set right, as a gift and a beginning. Name the one you would heal. And here Vale, who had spent his dying watching others suffer and being unable to lift a finger, felt the old refusal rise in him, not from selfishness, but from its opposite. "I would not choose one," he said. "If I am to be a healer, let me not begin by picking one worthy soul out of the many. Send me down empty-handed. Let me earn every mending myself." The stillness held for a long moment, and Vale had the strange impression that he had surprised a thing that could not be surprised. "Very well," the loom said at last. "An unusual choice yields an unusual outcome. You will keep what you would have spent. 2 boons you carry with you, unasked and unearned, born of the refusal itself. The first, you are unread. No power of that world will assess you, weigh you, or know your measure by any craft. You will be a blank in every reckoning but your own. The second, you are the borrower. Where others are bound to the gifts of their birth, you may take a gift you witness in another, copy it into yourself, once to keep, though the taking will cost you and cannot be done again until a season of rest has passed. Now go," the loom said, and the stillness poured itself out like water tipped from a jug, "and be counted." Vale Marin opened his eyes to green. He lay on cool moss at the edge of a forest pool, so still it seemed a fallen piece of sky. And the first breath he drew went down into lungs that did not fail, did not catch, did not betray him. Clean, cold air, scented with pine and water and the mineral sweetness of wet stone. He lay very still, afraid to move and break it. A dragonfly stitched the air above the water. Somewhere a bird he did not know made a liquid, doubling call. Then he sat up, and his body came with him, obedient, whole, thoughtless of itself, the way only the healthy are. He looked at his hands. They were a young man's hands, unspotted, the knuckles smooth, and when he made fists of them they closed without pain. He pressed them to his own chest and felt his heart going strong and even beneath the ribs. And only then did he understand, in his flesh and not merely in his mind, that he was alive. He got to his feet by the still pool, the still near. Some newborn knowing in him supplied the name, as though the world had left a single word in his pocket, and stood swaying under trees he had never seen, in a world that had no reason to want him, whole for the first time in longer than he could bear to remember. He laughed once, and the sound frightened the doubling bird into silence. He was alive. He was in a new world, and he had no earthly notion of what to do with either fact. The answer came, as answers to Vale's life had always come, in the form of someone else's trouble. He had walked perhaps half a mile from the Stillmere, following the downhill drift of the land the way water would, marveling stupidly at everything, the size of the ferns, the strangeness of the light, a beetle the deep blue of a bruise trundling across the path. When he heard the crying, a child's voice, high and cracked, with the particular despair of a child who has understood that grown-up help is not coming. It pulled him off the path and up a bramble-tangled slope thick with berry canes before he had decided to go, because that pull was older in him than any world. At the top of the slope, a boy of perhaps 10 knelt in the crushed brambles, his hands red to the wrist, bent over a dog. The dog was dying. Vale did not need to be told. The dying have a look, and he had spent years learning it. The animal, a rough-coated brown hound, not large, lay on its side, with its flank torn open in 3 long furrows, the work of some claw, and its breath came in the shallow, hurried sips of a body running out of blood. The boy pressed his small hands to the wound, as though he could hold the life inside by force of wanting, and it was leaking through his fingers all the same. "Please," the boy said, not to Vale, he had not yet seen Vale, but to the dog, to the air, to whatever might be listening. "Please, Barley, please don't." "Let me," Vale said, and dropped to his knees beside them. The boy startled, flinched, took him in. A stranger, wild-eyed, in clothes that were the wrong sort of clothes, and then did the thing Vale would remember about him always. He decided, in the space of a breath, that a stranger's hands were better than none, and he moved aside. "Can you help him? Are you a mender?" "Please, sir. He saved me from the shadelings. He stood right in front of me, and now he's—" "I don't know what I am," Vale said honestly, and put his hands to the wound. He did not know what he expected. He half expected nothing, that this world's strangeness stopped at his skin, that he was only a healthy man kneeling uselessly in the blood of a dying dog, as he had knelt uselessly 100 times before. But the moment his palms met the torn flesh, something answered. It was as if a door he had not known was in him swung open onto a room full of light, and a voice that was not the loom's great voice, but a smaller, clearer version of it, spoke inside his own attention. "A soul stands at the edge of its measure," the knowing said. "The loom offers a charge. Take up the calling of the mender, and set your hand to the mending of threads. Will you answer?" And beneath it, unspoken but understood, the shape of what the calling was. A healer's path. A life bent to the wombs of others, the vocation of one whose worth lay in what he could do for the broken. Some buried, frightened part of him recoiled. He had spent his death being tended, dependent, a body others labored over, and here was a life offering to make his whole existence about that same helpless station, only with the roles reversed. To be a mender was to be forever needed, and never quite free of the sick room. The dog's breath hitched and nearly stopped. Vale did not even feel himself choose. The choosing had been done long ago, in 100 white rooms. "Yes," he said. "I answer." The light came into him then, and through him, and out of his hands. It poured from his palms as a soft, pale fire, a hearth flame, the new knowing named it, that was not hot and did not burn, and where it touched the ruined flank, the torn edges of the wound stirred like living things and reached for one another. Vale felt the cost of it at once, a pull from some deep reservoir behind his breastbone, a dizziness as though he had stood too fast. The wellspring, he understood, the store of the working, and it was draining fast. He did not care. He bent his whole attention to the dog, the way he had once bent it to the frightened dying whose hands he could only hold. And now his hands could do more than hold. The furrows closed, the bleeding slowed and stopped. Beneath his palms, the animal's breath deepened, steadied, found its rhythm and kept it. Then a thing happened that he had not been warned of. A rush took him, a swell of clean, fierce joy, a sound almost like a distant horn, and a brightness behind his eyes. The surge of a thread growing, of a rank gained, a cascade. It was the most purely good feeling he had ever known, and it left him grinning and gasping and light-headed on his knees in the brambles. The dog Barley lifted its head, blinked at the world, and licked the boy's tear-streaked face. The boy made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and threw his arms around the animal's neck. Then, remembering himself, he turned to Vale with his whole face open. "You are a mender. You saved him. Sir, thank you. Thank you. My family, will give you whatever we have. Only that's not much, but He stopped, studied Vale's strange clothes, his strange bearing, the way he sat blinking as though the world were new. Something careful came into the boy's eyes. "You're a crossing," he said, half wonder and half wariness. "Aren't you? Crossed over from the other place?" "I think I must be," Vale said. "My name is Vale." "Corrin," the boy said. "Corrin Wick. And this is Barley." He hesitated, then made a decision as quick and whole as the first one had been. "You should come home with me." "You saved my dog, and you don't know anything. And it's getting on for dark, and my mother would skin me if I left a crossing wandering the reed wash on his own." He got to his feet, one hand buried in the ruff of the dog that a moment ago had been dying. "Can you walk? It's not far. Hollybeck's just down the way." Vale looked at the healed hound standing foursquare in the crushed brambles, at the boy who had trusted a stranger's hands, at his own hands, still faintly warm with a fire he had not known he possessed. He had crossed into this world empty, refusing to be handed a single mended soul. He had earned his first one within the hour. "I can walk," he said, and got up to follow the boy home. Hollybeck was a scatter of timber and thatch houses in a fold of the valley, wood smoke rising blue against a sky going the color of a plum, and Vale came into it in the last light, behind a boy and a dog, and drew every eye in the place. He was strange, and a village misses nothing. But Corrin went ahead of him, crying the news. "He's a mender, he's a crossing, he saved Barley, saved him dead to rights." And by the time they reached the common, a knot of people had gathered, and the wariness in their faces was doing battle with the older, deeper hunger of ordinary folk in an unkind world. The hope of a healer come among them. An old woman won the battle first. She came out of the crowd leaning on a stick, tall and broad and pale as winter, with a stillness about her that made Vale think, without knowing why, of standing stones. She looked at him a long moment, with eyes the grey of river ice. "A crossing," she said. It was not a question. "It has been 30 years since the last one passed through this district, and he did not stay. You have the look. The world sits on you like a coat that doesn't fit yet." She put out one enormous cold hand. "Halgra Steinvat. I am rhyme folk before you wonder at my height. We grow tall where I am from, and I have grown old on top of it. You are welcome at Hollybeck, Mender, for as long as you mend and behave. Both are conditions." A dry humor moved under the ice. "Come, you look as though you've forgotten how to eat." They fed him at the Wick Steading, a low, warm house just outside the village where the boy Corrin lived. There Vale met the rest of them. Odric Wick, the father, a big, slow, careful man with a farmer's forearms and a farmer's suspicion, who softened the instant his son told the story of the dog for the third time. Anwin, the elder daughter, quick and watchful, who set a place for Vale without being asked and watched him eat every bite of it. And in the warm dim of the back room, Maida. Maida Wick was the mother of the house, and she was dying. Vale knew it the moment he was brought to her bedside, and the knowing came now with the mender's clarity laid over the old human one. She lay propped and feverish, her breath thick, and beneath the blankets one leg was wrapped and swollen and wrong. A wound gone bad, Anwin told him quietly at the door. A scythe cut in the last harvest that had closed, and then, weeks later, turned. And now the rot was in it, and climbing, and no herb wife's poultice had turned it back. Vale put his hands to her and called the hearth flame, and it answered, and he poured what he had into her, and it was not enough. He felt the shape of the sickness the way one feels the size of a stone in the dark. It was deep, and it was wide, and it had roots in her that went beyond anything his newborn calling could reach. He could cool the fever, he could drive the poison back a little, by her breath and days. He could not pull it out. Not yet. He said as much, gently, and saw the family's brief blaze of hope gutter down to the low, steady flame of people long used to bad news. But Odric gripped his shoulder with a hand like a root and said, low, "You gave her a week she didn't have an hour ago. No man's owed more than he can give." And Anwen looked at him across the sickbed, with something in her face that was not hope exactly, but was near neighbor to it. And Vale understood that he had, without meaning to, taken up a burden he would not be able to set down. This family, this dying woman, this ticking count of days. He stayed. There was no question of leaving. That night he slept under a roof, in a bed in a world that wanted to kill him for what he was, and he had never been so glad of anything. In the morning, Halgra found him at the common and set him to work, and the work made a place for him the way nothing else could have. He mended the everyday wounds of everyday people, a woodcutter's split hand, a child's fever, an old man's failing eyes that he could not cure but could ease. Each mending drew a little from his wellspring and gave a little back in the strange, sweet increments of growth, and each one bound him a little tighter to Hollybeck. By the second day, the wariness was gone from the faces on the common. He was the mender now. He had never in either life had a place that was simply, unquestionably his, and he found, to his own surprise, that the sick room he had so dreaded had become, in the giving of it rather than the receiving, the one place he most wanted to be. But Maida did not mend, and every time he cooled her fever and bought her another handful of days, he felt the wall of his own smallness, and knew that if she was to live, he would have to grow far beyond what he now was. The Count was running. He could hear it some nights, like a clock in another room. He did not yet know how much the world would demand of him before that count ran out. On the third morning, a dwarf came to the common under the great oak, and in healing him, Vale learned what he truly was. The dwarf's name was Torvald Grimhold, an undelver, and he had walked up from the deep country diggings with a grinding pain in his hip that had bent him nearly double over his stick. He was broad as a door, and grey in the beard, and disinclined to be pitied, and he settled himself on the bench beneath the oak with the air of a man submitting to a bad bargain. "They tell me you're a mender," he said. "They also tell me you're a crossing, which means you don't know yet that healing an undelver is like trying to light a wet log. We're made stubborn. Our stone runs deep. Half your mender kind give up before they start." "I don't know enough yet to know when to give up," Vale said, and set his hands to the old dwarf's hip. The dwarf was right. Where Maida's sickness had been deep but soft, living tissue gone wrong, willing at least to be reached. Torvald's flesh met the hearth flame like slate meets rain. The pale fire slid off him, refused him, could find no purchase. Vale frowned and leaned into it, and as he did, something shifted in the way he was seeing. He had learned, in 3 days of mending, to half see the threads of the people he worked on, the bright weave of a living body laid out to his mender's attention. Now, pressing past the dwarf's stony resistance, he saw more. He saw, running through Torvald's weave like veins of a different metal, the man's gifts, the passive boons of his blood and his people, the things that made an undelver an undelver. There was the deep stone stubbornness itself, a grey, unyielding thing. There was a boon for finding true north underground, and there, coiled, cool and hard around the seat of the dwarf's thought, was a shield of the mind, a boon that turned aside fear and glamour and every working that sought to reach in and move a man against his will. Iron wit, the knowing named it. The instant Vale's attention touched it, and in the naming, he understood the second gift the loom had given him. He was the borrower. He could take this. He did not decide to, quite, any more than he had decided to save the dog. His attention closed around the boon the way a hand closes on something it has been reaching for all its life. And he took, copied it, drew a true likeness of it into his own weave, and the cost the loom had promised came due all at once. It was nothing like the sweet rush of a cascade. It was a wrenching, a nauseating pull, as though he had reached into his own chest and torn something loose and grafted it in raw. And for a moment, the common tilted and grayed, and he nearly went down off the bench. When it passed, he sat gasping, and coiled now around his own thought, cool and hard, and his was iron wit. He had also, he realized, at last managed to break through the dwarf's resistance. The effort of the taking had forced the hearth flame past the stone, and Torvald's hip was easing under his hands, the old grinding pain unknotting. The dwarf sat up straighter, testing it, his bushy brows climbing. "Well," he said. "Well now, you did it after all, and you don't even look pleased about it. You look like a man who's been kicked by a mule." He peered at Vale with a new and shrewder interest. "And here's the other queer thing. I have a boon for the taking of measure. I can read a man, weigh his rank and his callings at a glance. It's how I know who to trust in a dark tunnel. I read you the moment I sat down, out of habit." He shook his head slowly. "And I got nothing. Not a rank, not a calling, not a name. You're a blank slate, Mender. A hole in the world where a man's measure ought to be. I've never read a soul I couldn't read." He was not afraid. He was too old and too deep stone for that. But he was watchful. You want to be careful who tries to read you and comes up empty. Some folk take a blank very badly indeed. Unread, Vale thought. A hole in the world. He filed the warning away with a cold, small feeling that he did not yet have a name for. Then, because Vale had eased a pain 3 other menders had failed at, and because undelvers pay their debts to the copper, Torvald did something that would one day save Vale's life. A mender who can crack undelver stone deserves a proper gift, not a coin, he said, and set his own broad hand briefly over Vale's, and Vale felt the offered thing pass. The dwarf freely gave what Vale had already, unknown to him, stolen. The shape of iron wit, pressed toward him in generosity. And nothing happened. The boon glanced off him. He already held it, and the knowing supplied it now, too late. The borrower's cost, once paid, could not be paid again until a long season's rest had passed. He could not take a second gift so soon. The door was shut, and would stay shut for a time. Vale only bowed his head as though moved by the offer, and did not explain because how could he? "Thank you," he said, and meant it for more than Torvald could know. He had a mind shield now, cool and hard and coiled about his thought, and though he could not have said why, he had the strong sense that he had been handed something he would badly need. Torvald Grimhold went off down the deep road unbent and astonished, telling everyone he met about the crossing who could crack an undelver like a nut, and who read as a hole in the world. And Vale sat under the great oak, turning his new shield over in his mind, unaware that across the common, a knight had just ridden in, and that the day was about to turn violent.
The night came into Hollybeck at the head of the afternoon light, and the village went still around him the way a pond goes still when a heron lands. He wore the grey and gold of a militant order, a surcoat marked with a device Vale did not know, an eye held within a set of scales, and he wore it the way some men wear their bones, as though it were the truest thing about him. He was not large, but he moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never in his life been made to wait. And the folk of the common bent away from his horse's path and lowered their eyes. And even Halgra, Vale noticed, went quiet and careful and old. Vale did not know to be afraid. That was the whole of it afterward. He did not know. He had been 3 days in the world. He knew the hearth flame, and the shape of a fever, and the taste of Anwen's barley bread, and he did not know that a commoner does not meet a sealed word knight's eye, does not speak until spoken to, does not stand at his ease under the great oak as though he had a right to the shade. So when the knight's grey gaze swept the common and snagged on him, the one figure in it that had not bent, Vale, absurdly, nodded. A friendly, foolish, otherworldly nod, one man to another. "Good day," he said. The stillness on the common became a different kind of stillness. The knight walked his horse 3 slow steps closer and looked down at Vale for a long moment, and something moved behind his face. Not offense, not yet, but a hound's sudden interest. "You have manners like a stray dog," he said, almost mildly. "No matter. I am accustomed to teaching manners." And then, still mild, he did the thing that undelvers did in dark tunnels and knights did on the roads. He read him. Vale felt it. A cold attention laid over him, a hand reaching into the world to take his measure, and he felt it find nothing. He watched the knight's face, and he saw the exact instant the man came up empty, the instant the grey certainty curdled into something worse. Torvald's warning came back to him a heartbeat too late. Some folk take a blank very badly indeed. "You read as nothing," the knight said, and his voice had gone very soft and very flat. "No rank, no calling, no thread I can find. And yet you stand there breathing." He swung down from the horse. "Do you know what smells of nothing, commoner? Do you know what walks in a man's shape and shows no measure to the sealed word's eye? The uncounted. The things that do not belong to the world beneath the loom, that slip in through the cracks the undertow leaves open. There is a wrongness on you. I can taste it. It sits under your skin like river water. The undertow's own stink." He was drawing off one gauntlet, unhurried, folding it into his belt. "I am Sir Groft, of the sealed word, sworn to Audel the measured one, and it is my calling to unmake what does not belong. I don't yet know what you are, but I know you are wrong, and I will beat the shape of the truth out of you and let the order sort your bones." The first blow took Vale across the jaw before he understood that it was coming, and drove him down into the churned dirt of the common, and after that, there was no more talking. Sir Groft beat him with the patient thoroughness of a man doing honest work. Vale, who had never in either life raised his hands in a fight, could not have said how to begin, and even had he known, the knight's inherited boons made him a thing of iron and speed, against which a 3-day mender was nothing. Groft's fists and boots fell like a mill wheel. Vale felt ribs go. He felt the hot burst of his own blood in his mouth, the world narrowing to red and roaring, the particular loneliness of pain.
and threaded strangely through the horror of it, a small, clear astonishment. This is what it is to have a body that can be broken, and not simply fail. Even this is a kind of aliveness. The hearth flame stirred in him unbidden, knitting even as the night unmade, self-mending the worst of the damage as fast as it came, so that Groft's work went on past the point where an ordinary man would have died. The night frowning now, hitting harder, baffled at the commoner who would not stop breathing. And at the very edge of it, when the red had almost gone to black, when Vale hung at the lip of a second death, something came into him. It was not the hearth flame. It was cooler, older, vast. He felt it settle over the back of his neck and shoulder, like a hand, or like ink poured into water. And with it came a single, wordless certainty, a portent laid into his very flesh by the loom itself. He did not understand it. He only knew that a mark had been set on him. In that instant of nearly dying, ink the color of a night sky with stars scattered through it. A sealing mark, the knowing named it, faint and cold and prophetic. And that it meant something, some echo of a thread already woven, a promise or a doom he could not yet read. Then hands were pulling the night back. Not many. Hollybeck folk did not have it in them to strike a sealed word night, and they knew it would cost them dearly even to lay hold of one. But Halgra Steinvad was rhyme folk, and tall, and old past the age of caring greatly for consequences, and she got her enormous pale hands into the back of Groft's surcoat and hauled him off Vale with a strength that surprised him into staggering, and she put her bulk between them and did not move. "He is a mender under the loom's charge," she said, and her voice had the grind of glaciers in it. "Beat a charged mender to death on the open common before 40 witnesses, sir, and even the sealed word will want to know why. Take your suspicion to your order if you must. But take it, not his life, not here." For a long moment, Vale, through the one eye that would still open, watched the night weigh it. Groft was not a fool. 40 witnesses, a charged healer, a district lord who would not thank him for the trouble. The wrongness of the blank still sat under Vale's skin, and Groft still meant to see it answered. But not, his cold face decided, today, and not with his own hands in front of the whole village. "This is not finished," Groft said, to Vale, to Halgra, to the common at large. He pulled his gauntlet back on. "A thing that reads as nothing is a thing the Order will want. Remember that I found you first." He mounted and turned his horse, and rode out of Hollybeck at the same unhurried pace he had ridden in, and the village breathed again only when he was well gone. They carried Vale to the Wick steading, and he mended himself the rest of the way to Hole Over the following day, the hearth flame closing what Groft had opened, the ribs knitting, the blood gone back where it belonged. But he was changed all the same, and he knew it. He lay in the warm dim while Halgra sat by him and, when he could listen, told him the truths he had been too new to know. "You didn't understand what you were doing, meeting his eye," she said. "I know. That's the pity of it. But you must understand now because it will not go away." She turned his head gently to look at the mark that had come on him at the edge of death, and Vale saw the ice in her eyes go still with something like awe. "This, I know," she said slowly. "This is old. A mark like this was set once on a war hero of the Cinder Years, a healer who stood in the breach at Eaglespar and would not let the line die while there was breath in him. The tales say the loom marks so only where it means to make a hinge of a life, a place the world will turn on. I don't know what it means for you, I don't think you're meant to know yet." She let his head settle back. "But hear the other thing, and hear it plain. That night could not read you. To the sealed word, you smell of the undertow, of the uncounted, of the wrong side of the world. They hunt such things."
He will not forget you, and he serves an order that does not forget, and a house that does not forgive an insult to one of its knights. Her great cold hand covered his for a moment, and there was kindness in it, and warning.
"You are marked twice over now, Mender. Once by the loom, for something great. Once by the order, for death. And I cannot tell you which mark will reach you first." Vale lay still and felt the cold star ink on his neck, and the knitted ache of his ribs, and the count of Maida's dying days all at once, and understood that the place he had made for himself was already slipping out from under him. He had wanted only to live. The world had heard him, and had answered by making his living dangerous. Sir Groft was gone, but he had left the shape of the future behind him, and Vale could feel it closing. If Vale was to grow strong enough to pull the rot from Maida's leg, and grow strong enough now to have any hope against the thing Groft had promised, he could not do it mending split hands on the common. Growth, in this world, came from trial. Halgra told him where to find one: the marsh meadows south of Hollybeck, the reed wash, where something had lately gone wrong at the marsh's heart, so that the beasts of the fens had turned strange and vicious, and no one dared cut reeds or set eel traps anymore. Whatever cure Maida needed, whatever strength, the road to it ran through the marsh. So Vale took up a fire staff Odric pressed on him, a cinder staff, its head banded to hold a coal of the hearth flame, and went south to grow or die. He found a companion on the way, though at first he took him for an ambush. The small man dropped out of a roadside alder so silently that Vale's first warning was the prick of a knife point at the small of his back and a cheerful voice at his ear.
"Now then."
A lone traveller on the reed wash road, in a nice new coat, with a nice fire staff he's holding like a broom. Either you're a fool or you're bait, and I've been fooled by bait before. A pause. The knife did not press harder. You've the smell of Hollybeck on you. Barley bread and dog. You wouldn't happen to be the crossing mender the whole district's clucking about. The one that cracked an undelver and got beaten half to death by a sealed word bully and lived. I would happen to be exactly that, Vale said, very still. Though I'd take it kindly if you'd move the knife before we're friends. The knife vanished. Its owner came around to face him, and Vale looked down, some way down, at one of the small folk, a hobbin, no higher than Vale's ribs, wiry and sharp-featured, and older about the eyes than the rest of him let on, with a grin that had made a career of getting its owner out of the trouble the grin had gotten him into.
"Pipcord," he said, and sketched a bow that was 3 parts mockery and 1 part, Vale suspected, genuine. "Rogue, fixer, knife for hire when the hiring's honest, and a friend to the Wicks going back further than that boy's been alive. Odric sent word down the road that a mender they'd taken in was walking into the reed wash alone, like a lamb to the pot, and asked would anyone with sense head him off. The grin softened by a degree. I've got no sense to speak of, but I've got a debt to that family, and I've never in my life seen a fellow who could out-heal a knight's fists. I'll walk you to your trial, Mender, and I'll keep you breathing through it, and in exchange, you'll tell me what in the loom's counting it feels like to cross over from another world. Deal?" "Deal," Vale said, and found he was smiling for the first time since the common. They went into the marsh together, and the marsh tried to kill them, and Pipcord kept his word. It came at them in stages, as though the fen were testing what it faced before it committed. First, the marsh goblins, low green scuttling things with rusted knives
that boiled up out of a reed bed in a shrieking mob, and Vale, who had never fought, learned fighting in the space of 40 terrified heartbeats. He learned it because Pip fought at his back, like a dancer who had brought knives to the dance, and because the Cinderstaff, when Vale thought to ask it rather than swing it, spat the hearth flame in a gout that sent the reeds and the goblins in them up in white gold flame. And because, cornered, he found he could put the hearth flame not only into wounds but between himself and harm, a searing wall the small green things would not cross. Then the fen beetles came, chitinous things the size of dogs, armored where the goblins had been soft, and those he could not burn, and so he learned the other lesson, the truer one, that his strength would never be strength. He was fragile. His body could break. What he had instead was cleverness and the hearth flame and a companion, and he used all three, luring the great beetles onto ground where Pip's blades could find the soft seams of their joints, mending himself the instant a mandible opened his arm, so that no wound ever had time to cost him the fight. And once, in the middle of it, the cascade took him. The horn and light rush, the sweet, fierce swell of a rank gained, of a thread grown, and with it came a new working. A craft born of the fighting itself, a way of lending his own hard-won grit to a body pushed past its limit, so that when Pip flagged, gasping, Vale could set a hand to him and pour a second wind into him and send him back in fresh. When the last beetle lay smoking and the last goblin had fled, the two of them stood back to back in the churned reeds, filthy and bleeding and alive. And Pip laughed up at him with something like delight. "Well," the Hobbin said, wiping his knives, "you fight like a man who's read about fighting in a book. But you don't die, and you don't quit, and you kept me on my feet when I'd have gone down." He resheathed the blades and put out a small hard hand, and this time the bow in him was all genuine. "I said I'd walk you to your trial. I think I'll stay for the rest of it, if you'll have me. A fellow could do worse than tie his fate to a healer who won't let his friends fall." Vale took the offered hand. Above the reeds, where the fen thickened toward its dark heart, the water had gone unnaturally still, and something waited there. The thing that had turned the marsh strange, the true trial, the source of the wrongness. Whatever it was close now. "I'll have you," Vale said. "Come on. Whatever's spoiling this place is just ahead, and I've a feeling it's why we're both here." Together they turned toward the marsh's poisoned heart. The heart of the reedwash was a black pool ringed by dead trees, and out of it grew the thing that had spoiled the marsh. At first Vale took it for a fallen willow, a great humped mass of grey-green wood and trailing vine, twice the height of a man, set on the pool's far margin, like a crown of thorns grown out of the water. Then it moved. The whole mass shifted and settled with a wet, groaning creak, and a dozen eyes the color of pond scum opened along its trunk, and Vale understood that he was looking at the marsh heart itself, a living thing of root and rot, ancient and awful, and mad with some hunger he could not name. "Begilber," Pip breathed. And for the first time all day there was no laughter anywhere in him. "I've heard tell, but I never... Vale, listen to me and listen fast. That thing doesn't fight with its branches. It fights with your own head. It throws its seeds, and if one sticks in you, it puts a whisper in your skull, and the whisper feels like your own thought, and it turns you. Every beast in this marsh that's gone wrong, it's wearing them. Don't let it." The marsh heart flung its seeds. They came in a hissing cloud, small barbed burrs trailing filaments of pale root, and where they struck the dead trees they clung, and where they struck flesh, Vale felt one take him in the shoulder, another in the throat, felt the barbs bite and the filaments burrow. They reached. He felt the whisper begin, a soft, persuasive murmur, rising up out of his own mind, wearing the voice of his own thoughts. Put down the staff. The fighting is pointless. The water is cool and the marsh is old, and you are so tired. Kneel. Kneel and be still, and let the green take you. And it slid off him. Iron wit, cool and hard and coiled about his thought. Torvald's gift, the thing he had stolen and been given both, turned the whisper aside the way it had once been made to turn aside a tunnel's terrors. Vale felt the burr's filaments claw for purchase in his mind and find only smooth, cold iron, and the voice that wore his voice guttered and failed. He tore the burrs from his flesh and stood clear-headed in the hissing rain of them, while, all around the pool, the thralls the marsh heart had already made came shambling out of the reeds to defend it. Enthralled beetles, a great blank-eyed marsh stag, 3 goblins moving with the jerky wrongness of the ridden. "It can't touch me," Vale shouted. "Pip, it's in my head, and it can't hold. Get behind me." He waded in. It was the hardest fight of his short, new life, and it was won not by strength, but by the one advantage the loom's strange gifts had given him. He could not be turned, so he turned the fight instead. Where the marsh-heart flung a thrall at him, Vale met it not with the cinderstaff, but with a hand and a hard pulse of the hearth flame, and found he could burn the burrs out of the ridden beasts, could sear the pale filaments loose from a stag's fevered brain and free it, so that one by one, the thralls the marsh-heart had stolen came back to themselves and blundered away, and the thing at the pool's heart was stripped of its army by the very mender it had tried to enslave. Pip worked the flanks, his blades finding the soft joints in the burr clusters, hamstringing the beetles that would not be freed, keeping always between Vale and the barbed rain, the one thing the Hobbin could give, his own body, unshielded, trusting the healer at his back to keep him whole when a burr got through. And when the thralls were gone, and the marsh-heart flailed its groaning branches in something like panic, Vale walked up to it through the last of its failing whispers, set the cinderstaff's coal against the wet grey wood of its trunk, and asked the hearth flame for everything he had. The white gold fire went up the trunk like a scream made light. The eyes along it clouded and burst. The great humped mass shuddered, sagged, and came apart with a final wet groan into smouldering ruin. And the black pool, at last, lay quiet. And the marsh, Vale could feel it, let out a long breath, and began, for the first time in a season, to be only a marsh again. A cascade took him where he stood, hard, the horn and light rush nearly buckling his knees. When it cleared, he was breathing like a bellows, scorched and bleeding and grinning, and Pip was pounding him on the arm and crowing. And there in the steaming wreckage of the thing lay the 2 prizes it had guarded without knowing. At its root, a dense knot of grey-violet wood, no bigger than a fist, still faintly warm. The marsh-heart's spirit core, its true heart, the thing that had held all its stolen minds. And beside it, half grown into the wood, as though the creature had made it out of its own worst power, a circlet of pale violet root, delicate as woven straw, and humming, very faintly, with the same terrible whisper Vale had just resisted. Pip crouched over the circlet without touching it. "That," he said quietly, "is a band of the Begilber. You know what it does, if a person could bear to use it. It does to others what that thing tried to do to you. Put it on, point at a foe,
and for a breath, they're not their own anymore. They're yours. He looked up at Vale. There's a witch keeps an island in the deep marsh. Mother Salawan, the marsh widow. She'll want the heartcore. It's the sort of thing she trades in, and she'll teach you more about what you are for the having of it than anyone in Hollybeck could. And she'll know what to do about that band. He hesitated. I'll tell you now, though. Most folk that win one of those can't stomach to keep it. It's a slaver's tool, turning a mind against itself. His eyes flicked, just once, to the fading, iron-cold mark on Vale's neck, and away. But most folk aren't being hunted. Take it or leave it. That's between you and your gut. Only decide before we're standing in front of the widow. Vale looked at the humming violet circlet in the smoking ruin and felt his gut turn over exactly as Pip had promised it would. He had just spent everything he had, refusing to let his own mind be taken. The thought of doing that to another soul, of reaching in and unmaking someone's will, the way the marsh heart had tried to unmake his, sat in him like swallowed ice. He did not answer. He gathered up the warm grey heartcore and left the band lying, and said only, "Take me to the widow." But he did not tell Pip to leave the circlet behind, and after a moment, saying nothing, Pip wrapped it in a scrap of oilcloth and tucked it away. Neither of them spoke of it. It came with them, all the same. Mother Salawan kept a hummock of dry land deep in the fen, the widow's 8, a single high knoll crowned with a crooked cottage and a garden of things that had no business growing so far from any honest field. And she was waiting on her threshold when Pip poled their borrowed punt up to her landing, as though she had known for hours they were coming. Perhaps she had. She was a small, bent woman, with a face like a walnut and eyes that missed nothing. And she took one look at Vale and said, before any greeting, "You've the marsh heart on you, and a hole where your measure ought to be. Come in, Crossing, and mind the toad on the step. He's older than your kingdom." Inside, over a fire that burned green, she traded him truth for the heart core. And it was a fair trade. She took the warm grey knot of wood from him and turned it in her clever old hands and set it in a bowl on her mantel with a proprietary satisfaction. And in exchange, she gave him the thing he most needed and did not have: understanding. "You mend," she said, "and you burn, and you copy, and you resist. And you've no notion how any of it hangs together, do you? A man swinging a hammer he thinks is a stick." She stirred the green fire. "Everything the loom lets a living thing do runs on threads. 20 root threads, the fundamentals: wood and water, fire and frost, flesh and bone, mind and void, and the rest. Most workings draw on one. The rare and dangerous ones draw on 2 threads twined together. Woven threads, we call them. And they do things a single thread never could." She gestured at the bowl. "That heart core there was grown of wood and mind twined into one. The fey thread, the marsh folk name it. The thread of glamour and thrall, and the whisper that wears your own voice. It's why the Begilber could ride other minds. It's why the band you won can do the same." Her walnut face creased shrewdly. "And you resisted it, with Undelver iron in your head, in a mender's body, wearing no measure at all. You are a very strange loom thread, Vale Marin. The strangest I've seen, and I've seen the undertow dance." They divided the spoils by the green fire, and it was there that Vale faced the thing he had left lying and could not, in truth, leave. Pip laid the oilcloth bundle on her table and unwrapped the violet band, and the whisper of it filled the little room. And Salawan looked at it, and then at Vale, with a long, weighing look. "You don't want it," she said. It was not a question. "Good.
The ones who want it are the ones who shouldn't have it.
But hear an old woman who has watched a great many people die of squeamishness. She leaned close, and the green firelight moved in her missing nothing eyes. A tool has no soul, boy. The band is only a band. Its wickedness is all in the hand. You've a knight's whole order sworn to hunt you, and a family of good folk who'll be the poorer for loving you. A day is coming. I can't tell you when. The threads don't run so plain. When the only thing standing between someone you love and a killing blow will be your willingness to reach into an enemy's head for one breath and make him yours. And on that day, you will want to have carried the thing you were too clean to touch. She sat back. Or you won't. And you'll bury someone. Your choice. But make it with open eyes, not a closed stomach. Vale looked at the humming circlet for a long while. He thought of the whisper wearing his own voice. He thought of Maida's dying breath, of Corran's red hands, of the way Pip had put his unshielded body between Vale and the barbs, trusting to be kept whole. He thought of a knight's fists and a mark of night and stars, and of a war ahead that Halgra said the world might turn upon. Then he wrapped his revulsion around itself and set it down, and he picked up the band. It settled cold against his wrist, and its whisper turned toward him, questioning, obedient. He did not use it. He only wore it, and felt the wrongness of it, and made himself keep feeling it. I'll carry it, he said, low. But I won't use it on anyone whose death I'm not standing in the way of. If I ever use it easily, Pip, you have my leave to take it off my corpse and throw it in the sea. Pip did not laugh. Agreed, he said quietly, and something passed between the two of them that was better than laughter. Salowen watched them both, satisfied, and gave Vale one last gift as they left, a scrap of learning about his own borrower's cost, and a warning that the strangeness on him would draw more than Marsh Witch's interest before long. Then she pulled them off her 8 herself, standing in the punt like a heron, and pointed them back toward Hollybeck, and called after them across the darkening water. Go quick, Crossing. The world's got the smell of you now. Quick things live longest. They went quick. But when they came up over the last hill above the Wick steading in the failing light, Vale saw the lamps burning at the windows, and the yard full of standing horses that did not belong to any farmer, and knew before Pip said a word that they had not gone quick enough. Down, Pip hissed, and pulled Vale flat behind the hill's crown, before the horses' owners could see 2 shapes against the dusk. They lay in the wet grass and looked down at the steading, and Vale's heart went to lead. There were armed men in the Wick yard. Not a sealed word knight in grey and gold. This was cruder. A half-dozen rough riders in the buff and brown of a noble house's hired swords, lounging by the barn with the boredom of men set to watch a place and wait. A lantern burned over the steading door. Odric stood in the doorway with his big, careful body making a wall of itself, Anwen behind him, and the riders were not troubling to be gentle with their questions. I'll go closer, Pip breathed. They'd never seen me, and I'm small, and it's dark. Stay here, and for the loom's sake, don't nod at anyone. And he was gone down the slope like a spill of shadow before Vale could argue. He was back inside a quarter hour, and his sharp face was grim in a way Vale had not yet seen on it. It's worse than a knight's grudge, he said. They're House Marrowgate men, Sir Groft's people, and they're not here to arrest you. They're here to wait for you, because there's paper out. He drew a folded scrap from his jerkin. He'd lifted it, Vale understood, from somewhere it hadn't been nailed down well enough. In the last grey light, Vale made out a crude woodcut of a hooded figure, and heavy black letters, and a sum of money underneath that made even Pip's practiced eyes go wide when he'd first read it. A bounty, Pip said. On an uncounted? Styled dangerous?
To be taken living if the taker's brave, and dead if he's sensible. That's you. And
His jaw tightened.
there's a second name under yours, and a smaller sum. Pip Cord, Hobbin, known associate. So that's both of us on the boards now. But why so much?
Vale said. The figure had been ruinous. A lord's ransom, the price of a manor, set on a 3-day mender who had never harmed a soul in this world. I offended one night. I healed a dog and some fevers.
Why would a house spend a fortune to? Because Groft couldn't read you.
Pip said it flatly. The pieces long since fitted together in his quick mind.
Think it through the way they will. A sealed word knight lays his redding on a man and gets nothing. No rank, no calling. A blank where a soul's measure ought to be. To them, that's not a curiosity. It's the definition of the enemy. The uncounted are the things that slip in through the undertow's cracks and don't belong to the loom's counting. And the whole reason the order exists is to unmake them before they root. So Groft can't prove what you are, but he can't prove you're not either. And to the sealed word, an unprovable blank is worse than a proven demon. They'll spend anything to close a hole in the world before it widens.
Add that you shamed one of their knights before 40 witnesses and lived, and that you cracked an undelver and out-healed a beating, and every ugly rumor that's run ahead of us down the road. He spread his small hands. That's your fortune. You're not a man to them, Vale. You're a breach in the wall, and they've priced you like one. Vale lay in the dark grass and felt the world he had so briefly, gladly belonged to close its doors against him, one by one. Welcomed healer to hunted thing in the space of 4 days. He thought he ought to feel afraid, and he did. But underneath the fear was something harder and steadier that surprised him, an old stubbornness worn smooth as a river stone. He had lost a whole first life to helplessness, watching others suffer with his hands tied. He would not lie in a field and let it happen a second time. "Maida's still in there," he said. "Still dying. I can pull the rot now. I felt it. After the marsh heart. I've grown enough.
If I go in, I can save her." "If you go in," Pip said, "you'll be walking into a yard full of Marrowgate swords who are paid a manor to take you."
I know. Vale turned to look at the small, fierce shape of his friend in the dark. "You don't owe me this. Your name's on the boards because of me. You could walk down the far side of this hill right now and be a hobbin no one's looking for by morning." For a moment, Pip Cord was very still. Then he laughed, low and soft, and without much humor, and it was the truest thing Vale ever heard him say.
"I made a promise to that family a long time before I made one to you," he said. "Odric Wick pulled me out of a debt hole once when I'd have gone under it, and I don't forget. His wife's dying 20 yards from where we're lying, and the one man in the kingdom who can save her is trying to give me leave to run."
He drew his knives and checked their edges by feel, and his grin came back, thinner and fiercer than before.
"No."
"We're going to get you in there, and you're going to pull that rot, and we're going to get out clean, and then we're going to run so far and so fast that the sealed word wears out 3 sets of boots looking for us. That's the plan. It's a bad plan. It's the only one that lets me keep both my promises." He nudged Vale's arm with one bony elbow. "Now stop trying to be noble and help me think, because those swords aren't going to distract themselves." Vale looked from his friend to the lamplit steading, where a good woman lay dying, and a good family stood in the door refusing to give him up, and the fear in him settled at last into something like resolve.
"All right," he said.
"Then let's give them something to look at that isn't the back door." The plan they made was cheap and loud, and depended entirely on the fact that hired swords watch a house, not a hillside, and on Odric Wick, who, when Pip crept close enough to whisper it through the barn's back slats, understood in an instant, and became, for one night, a conspirator. It went like this. Near midnight, when the Marrowgate men had settled into the sullen half-doze of the long watch, the Wick's own beasts came out of the barn all at once. Odric had loosed them from within. The plough oxen, the milk cow, the flock of geese, the 2 shag-coated ponies, and Pip had gone among them first with a handful of stinging nettle and a lit brand, and the particular malice of a hobbin who knows exactly how to turn a placid animal into a panic. And the result was bedlam.
A wall of frightened livestock burst out of the barn's near end, straight through the watcher's lounging line, geese screaming, an ox the size of a wagon putting its head down and going through a fence as though it were made of bread. The Marrowgate men came off the ground, swearing, 3 of them knocked flat, the rest scattering to catch horses that had torn their pickets in the stampede. And in the churning dark and dust at the front of the steading, no one at all was watching the low door at the back. Vale and Pip were through it before the first ox reached the road. Inside, the steading was all held breath and lamplight. Anwen had the back room ready. Vale had told her through the door what he meant to do, and she had cleared it and set water and rags out of some instinct for what healing wanted. And now she stood, white-faced and steady at her mother's head, while, outside, the shouting rose and fell. Corin crouched in the corner with both arms around Barley's neck to keep the dog from barking, his eyes enormous. And on the bed lay Maedawick, sunk deeper than when Vale had left her, her breath a wet rattle now, the swollen wrong leg gone a colour that Vale, in his first life, had learned to read as the beginning of the end. He put his hands on her, and this time he did not stop at cooling the fever. He reached down into the sickness, the way he had reached into the marsh heart's whisper, all the way, past the surface, to the deep, wide roots of the rot he had not been strong enough to grasp before. He was strong enough now. The marsh had grown him. The days had grown him. He had a rank behind his calling that the newborn mender by her bedside a week ago had not owned. He called not the gentle hearth flame, but the harder working the trials had taught him. The one the knowing named Draw the Rot. And it was terrible to do, and terrible to watch. He did not soothe the poison, he pulled it. He gathered the rot to himself through his own palms and drew it up and out of her in a foul, dark tide. And he felt it try to sink its roots into him as it came, felt the sickness fight to keep its hold, and he wrestled it out of her a handspan at a time, with his teeth set and sweat standing on him, and his wellspring emptying like a holed cask. Anwen made a small sound. The wrong colour went out of Maeda's leg. The rattle in her chest loosened, caught, and then eased into the long, deep, even breaths of a body that has finally been allowed to rest. The fever broke under Vale's hands in a sudden dew, and Maedawick's eyes fluttered and opened and found her daughter's face, and she said, hoarse, bewildered, alive, "Anwen, why are you crying, love?"
"What's all the shouting?" A cascade broke over Vale as the last of the rot came free, so hard on the heels of the effort that it nearly put him on the floor, and Anwen caught his arm, and he stood, swaying and spent, and grinning like a fool at the woman he had, at last, actually saved. There was no time for more. The stampede would be caught, the watch would reform, and every heartbeat they lingered was one that might see the back door discovered. Odric came in from the yard, smelling of dust and animal panic, took one look at his wife, sitting up in the bed with colour in her face, and his big, careful control cracked straight across. He crossed the room and gripped Vale's face in both his rough hands, and could not, for a moment, say anything at all. Then he found it. "You'll go now," he said, thickly. "You'll go, and you'll not come back."
because they'll watch this place for a year on the chance of it, and I'll not have you die to visit us. But hear me, Mender." His grip tightened.
"This family is yours, wherever you run to, whatever they call you on their boards. You've a hearth here, as long as one of us draws breath. The breath you gave her. Now go, before I have to bury the man who saved my wife." Anwin pressed a wrapped bundle of food into Pip's hands. Corran, weeping openly, would not let go of Vale's coat until Vale knelt and promised him, a promise he meant with his whole marked and hunted heart, that he would look after himself, the way Corran had looked after Barley, all the way, not quitting till it was done. And then they were out the back door into the dark, 2 names on the boards of a kingdom that wanted them dead, running low across the fields, away from the wick steading and everything in it that had, for 4 bright days, felt like home. Behind them, a woman who should have been dead breathed easy in her bed. Ahead lay the whole hostile length of Aldraver, and somewhere past it the coast, and past that the Free Isles, and between them and any of it, the hunt.
"Coast," Pip panted as they went. "Nothing for it now. Heron's Reach, the Stilt Port, and a ship to the Lytton Isles where the sealed words writ doesn't run. It's a long way and every mile of it wants us dead."
He risked one glance back at the shrinking lights.
"But we did it. She's up. She's talking."
A fierce grin wet at the edges.
"Loom's counting, Vale. You actually did it."
"We did it," Vale said, and did not look back, because he could not afford to, and ran on into the dark toward the sea. They ran through the rest of that night, and did not stop running, in the loose sense, for days. By the grey of pre-dawn, they had put the Wick district behind them, and struck out cross-country toward the salt-weft coast, and Pip, who carried a map of the kingdom in his head the way other men carry their own names, laid out the road as they went, crouched over a scratch in the dirt while they caught their breath in a hedgerow.
"Straight south's no good. That's the Verberg Bridge and the trade road, and a bridge is a bottle, and a bottle's where they'll cork us. West and around costs us a week we haven't got, with the bounty riding ahead of us on every post horse in Old Reaver."
His grubby finger drew the hard line.
"So we go the middle way, down through the old borderland, the Hollow March, and across the Andy Wash where it's wild and unwatched, and come at Heron's Reach from the fen side where the paper's thinnest. It's the fastest road and the ugliest. The Hollow March is undertow country, fey country, the kind of place where the trees keep count of you."
He looked up at Vale. "Ordinarily, I'd sooner walk into a bear's mouth, but the hunt behind us is worse than the hunt ahead, and I'd rather chance the undertow folk than a house that's priced you like a breach in a wall." There was another reason for the middle road, and Vale learned it that first day when the pursuit first showed its teeth. They had thought, being afoot and cross-country, to have a lead of hours. They did not. By midday, Pip, who read the land as easily as its map, went still on a rise and swore softly. Behind them, further off but closing at a pace no honest horse could keep over that ground, came riders. And running low and silent before the riders, a shape that flowed over broken country as though it did not touch it.
"They've brought undertow help,"
Pip said grimly.
"A courser sprite, or worse. Something that runs the shortcuts, the places where a mile folds up small if you know the trick of it. That's how they're gaining."
"That's the undertow's own gift, and it means they've paid the Fae to hunt us, which is a thing that costs more than money and tells you exactly how badly the Order wants your head." He spat. "It also means we can't outrun them the honest way. We need our own trick." Vale had one. He had bought it in Heron's Reach, despite... No, he had it already. A thing pressed on him days ago and half forgotten in the rush of everything since.
a smooth, flat river stone on a thong that Odric had turned out of an old strongbox and given him along with the cinderstaff, muttering that it had come to the steading in trade and no one had ever puzzled out its use. Vale had puzzled it out on the second night of running, when exhaustion made him careless and he wished himself across a ditch he was too tired to jump, and found himself, between one blink and the next, on the ditch's far side, the stone gone warm as a coal at his throat, and his stomach lurching as though he'd missed a stair. A skipstone, the knowing had named it. A short blink, a stone's throw and no more, and it needed a slow while to cool and ready itself between uses, and he had learned this the way one learns such rules, by testing the edges of it. It could carry him only where his eye could reach across open ground. It could leap a ditch, a wall, a gap in a fight. It could not, he found when he tried it in longing at the sight of a far ridge, span any real distance. And it recoiled from wide water entirely, refusing to carry him even to the middle of a broad pond, as though the stone knew the difference between a step and a journey. That's a blessing and a curse both, Pip judged when Vale showed him. It'll get you out of a corner nobody else could climb out of. It won't get us to the coast. Nothing skips that far.
And it won't cross the Anderwash for you when we reach it.
That river's a quarter-mile bank to bank in flood, and your little stone won't span a tenth of it. He tucked the knowledge away with everything else. Still, a man who can be here and then there in a fight is a man worth having. Save it for when it's life or death. It's got the feel of a thing that decides which. So they ran the middle road, the fugitive and the hobbin, growing lean and quick and quiet with it, and something grew between them in the running that neither named. It was in the way Pip fell asleep with his back to Vale's, without thinking to keep a knife hand free, trusting the mender to wake first at any wrong sound. In the way Vale, without discussion, poured a thread of his own healing into his friend each cold morning to take the ache of the road out of his short legs. It was the ease of two people who have decided, past all reckoning of debt, to belong to each other's survival. But the hunt gained. Each day the riders and their folded mile fay were a little closer at their backs, until on the fourth evening the land dropped away before them into a country of black pines and blacker hollows, of trees that leaned wrong, and a silence that had a listening quality to it. And Pip stopped at its edge and would not for a moment go in. "The hollow march," he said quietly. "Here's where the honest world ends. Keep your iron in your head, Mender. Whatever that dwarf gift is doing behind your eyes, hold it tight, because in there they'll come at your mind before they ever show you a blade." He drew his knives. Overhead the first stars were coming out, cold in a greenish sky, and from somewhere deep among the leaning pines, thin and sweet and wrong, came the sound of a pipe. The piping came from everywhere and nowhere, and where it went, the cold followed. They had not gone a bowshot into the hollow march before Vale felt it. A creeping frost that had nothing to do with the season, blooming up out of the black soil and along the leaning trunks, rimming every needle and blade of grass with ice as the tune wandered nearer. The music itself was the true danger, though. It wound into the ear and down into the will, a sweet, dragging weariness that whispered, "Sit, rest. The cold is only sleep, and sleep is only rest." And Vale felt Pip stumble beside him and go to one knee, his sharp face gone slack and dreaming. "Pip!" Vale hauled him up. The iron in Vale's own head turned the tune aside. He heard the sweetness and felt the pull, and let it slide off the cold, hard coil of Torvald's gift. But Pip had no such shield, and the ice was already climbing his boots, a pale, glittering moss of frost spreading up the hobbin's legs to root him where he swayed. Vale clapped a hand to his friend's chest and poured the hearth flame into him, not to heal, but to warm. and the frost hissed and receded, and Pip came back into his own eyes with a gasp and a snarl. Then the piper showed itself. It came out of the trunk of a leaning pine, as though it had been part of the wood. A squat, sinewy thing, the grey-blue of old ice, knuckled and long-armed, with red eyes and a set of stone pipes at its lips. And it wore a cap, the dark, wet red of a wound. A Powery of the frost, one of the undertow's cruelest. And it did not walk so much as blink, vanishing from beside one tree to reappear beside another a dozen paces off, always piping, always circling, weaving its net of ice tighter with every pass, while it stayed forever out of reach. This was the thing the Order had paid to run them down. This was the folded mile made flesh. "It won't stand and fight," Pip panted, hacking the frost moss off his own legs with a knife.
"It'll pipe us to sleep and freeze us in our tracks and take its cap dye from our throats at leisure. We have to pin it. But you can't catch a thing that blinks."
"I can," Vale said. He could be here and then there. The stone at his throat had cooled and readied. He had been saving it for exactly this. So Vale let the piper circle, let it think him slow and shielded and stupid, tracked the rhythm of its blinking the way he tracked the marsh hart's thralls. And the next time it winked into being behind a near trunk to loose a fresh gout of freezing music, Vale skipped. The world lurched. The skipstone flared warm, and he was simply there, inside the piper's reach before it could vanish again, the cinderstaff's coal already swinging. The hearth flame took the frost thing full across its knuckled chest, and it screamed, a sound like ice cracking on a lake, and blinked away. But it was hurt now, and slower, and its pipe faltered. After that it was Pip's fight as much as Vale's, and the two of them fought it the way they had learned to fight everything, together and clever and unrelenting. Each time the Powery blinked away to catch its breath and its tune, Vale skipped to close the gap the instant the stone allowed, driving it, never letting it settle into the circling rhythm that was its whole strength. And each time Vale forced it to stand, Pip's knives were already flying, thrown low and hard to find the joints of its long arms, to nick the wrist that held the pipes, to make it flinch its music off-key. Frost and fire, blink and skip. And slowly the thing that had never in its long, cold life been cornered, found itself cornered. Pinned at last against the very tree it had come out of, Vale's skip landing him inside its guard one final time, while Pip's thrown blade took it through the piping wrist. The cinderstaff came down. The hearth flame went into the frost thing's chest, and did not come out, and the red eyes clouded, and the stone pipes fell silent, and the Powery of the hollow march slid down the trunk of its tree, and did not get up. The unnatural cold went out of the wood all at once, like a held breath let go. A cascade rolled through Vale where he stood over the dead piper, and with it came a new working, born of the cold he'd just endured. The knowing named it as it settled into him. A numbing touch, a way of laying deadness into flesh, of stealing sensation and movement from a limb with a touch. He filed it away without understanding yet why he would ever want to stop a thing feeling rather than heal it. He was too spent and too glad, and Pip was already at his elbow tugging. "Good, that's good. But listen." The Hobbin's face was grim under its grin. "That piper wasn't running us down on its own. Something set it on us and stayed back, and now that it's dead." From somewhere behind them, back the way they'd come, rose the deep belling of hounds, and under it the drum of riders who had let their fey scout do the hard work of cornering and were now closing to finish it. "There it is, the hunt proper. They're on us, Vale,
and this wood's done hiding us.
Pip was already moving, hauling Vale by the sleeve deeper into the black pines, downhill, toward a sound Vale could now hear beneath the hounds. A vast, wet rushing, a great voice of moving water.
Run! There's a river ahead, and it's the only wall between us and those dogs. If we can get across the Andy Wash, they lose the scent and the horses can't follow. If we can't...
He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. They ran, the baying rising at their backs, down through the leaning trees toward the roar of the flood.
They broke out of the tree line, and the Anderwash lay before them in the starlight, and Vale's heart failed him at the sight of it. It was in full flood, a quarter-mile of black water gone wild with the spring melt, its surface torn with standing waves, and the pale wreck of whole trees turning end over end in the current, its voice a continuous shuddering roar that he felt in his chest more than heard. The far bank was a low, dark line, impossibly distant across all that moving death. And behind them, close now, the hounds gave tongue as they hit the fresh scent at the wood's edge.
The stone!
Pip gasped.
Skip us over!
It won't. Vale already knew it, sick with the knowing. He gripped the skipstone and turned his eye across that vast, churning span, and felt the thing recoil in his very hand, refusing, the way it had refused the broad pond days ago. It knew the difference between a step and a journey, and this was a journey made of drowning.
It won't cross wide water. I told you, Pip, it can't. It won't take us even a tenth of the way. For one heartbeat, the two of them stood trapped between the river that would drown them and the hunt that would kill them. And Vale saw the same calculation run behind Pip's eyes that ran behind his own. And both of them refused the same answer at the same moment. Not the dogs. Anything but the dogs. Then we swim it, Pip said. And we don't drown. Because I've a very good reason not to, and so do you. He was already tearing at the lashings of a great drift log jammed against the bank, the trunk of some flood-killed pine as big around as a barrel. Get this loose, it floats. We go over the top of it and we kick like the loom's own devils, and we let the current take us downstream as far as it wants, so long as it takes us across. A hound crashed out of the trees behind them. Then another, red-mouthed in the starlight. Pip didn't look back. Vale! Now! They took the river together.
It was the coldest and most terrible thing Vale had done in either of his lives. And afterward, he could never put it in order. Only fragments, hammered into him by the flood. The first plunge that drove the breath out of him and turned his whole body to a screaming numbness the instant the black water closed over it. The log wrenching in his arms, alive with the current's fury, trying always to roll and pin them under. Pip, so much smaller, nearly torn away in the first 100 yards, and Vale getting one arm around the Hobbin's chest and refusing to let the river have him, so that they went the rest of the way lashed together over the plunging trunk, kicking, choking, the far bank crawling nearer with a slowness that was its own kind of agony. Somewhere in the middle of it, the cinderstaff, snagged crosswise on a submerged branch, dragging them down, its lashing fouled beyond any freeing with numbed fingers in the dark, became a choice between the staff and their lives. And Vale let it go. He felt it torn away downstream, the good firestaff Odric had given him, and had no strength to mourn it. He had a friend to keep breathing, and a bank to reach, and nothing at all to spare for grief. They struck an eddy at last, near the far side, that spun them out of the main current, and Vale got his feet on stones and hauled Pip up out of the water by main force, and they crawled up the mud of the far bank on their hands and knees and lay there, retching river water, unable for a long while to do anything but shake. Across the flood,
The hounds raged along the near bank, their belling gone thin and furious with the vast black water between. Torches gathered there, small and helpless in the dark. No horse would take that river. No dog could hold that scent across it. The hunt had come to the Andy Wash, and the Andy Wash had turned it back.
There,
Pip croaked, when he could speak, flat on his back in the mud and grinning up at the cold stars through chattering teeth.
told you. Very good reason. Best wall in Aldrever, that river. And it doesn't take a copper in bribes.
He turned his head and looked at Vale. Soaked, shuddering, alive, one arm still flung over his friend's chest, as though he had forgotten to let go. Something in the Hobbin's sharp face went quiet and unguarded.
You wouldn't let go of me, he said. In the worst of it. You'd have gone down keeping hold of me. You know that, you great fool of a mender. I know,
Vale said, and did not let go. They lay in the mud a while longer, past the reach of the hounds, lighter by one firestaff, and colder than either had ever been. And then Vale set a hand on his friend, and gave him what warmth his emptied wellspring could still spare. And Pip did the only thing a Hobbin could do in return, and shared out Anwin's soaked and ruined bread. And the two of them ate it, laughing, because it was that or weep. Then they got up, because they had to, and turned their backs on the river and the raging hunt beyond it, and walked south into the last stretch of country before the sea, toward Heron's Reach, and a ship, and whatever was waiting for them in the stilt port that the Bounty might already have reached ahead of them. Heron's Reach rose out of the brackish lagoons of the salt-weft coast, like a city built by wading birds, a mad sprawl of timber houses and warehouses and taverns, all raised on stilts and pilings above the tidal mud, joined by a cat's cradle of plank walkways and rope bridges and floating rafts, the whole of it creaking and stinking and thronged, gulls screaming over the fish racks and the masts of coastwise cogs crowding the outer quays. After the black silence of the Hollow March and the killing river, the noise and press of it was almost a comfort. A man could be no one here. A man could disappear. Or could hope to. They came into the port footsore and salt-stained 2 days after the river, and Pip's first act was to buy news along with bread, and the news was bad. "The paper's here," he murmured, steering Vale by the elbow through the crush of a plank market, his voice pitched under the gull scream. "Ahead of us, like I feared. Postboats are faster than fugitives." Your face is on a board outside the harbour master's, and the sum on it's got every hungry knife in Heron's Reach dreaming. Worse, he drew Vale into the lee of a net shed. There's grey and gold in the port. Sealed word. Not just Marrowgate hirelings now. The Order itself has sent men down to the coast, because the coast is where an uncounted runs, and everyone knows it. They're watching the quays. They're watching the ships. So, he blew out a breath. We do this careful and we do this fast. You keep your hood up and your head down and you learn, right now, to be forgettable. A mender who can pass through a crowd like water through a net. I'll teach you the trick of it. And meanwhile, we get you fitted out for a sea voyage and get ourselves onto a hull bound for the Lytton Isles before the Order works out which face under which hood is the one they've priced. The provisioning went quickly, in one long, tense afternoon, at a rambling chandler's warren of a shop, where a single sharp-eyed shopkeep sold everything a fugitive might need and asked nothing about why. There, Vale spent the last of the Wick's coin and the small hoard of the marsh, on a heavy, reinforced stave to replace the lost cinderstaff, plain iron-shod oak, charmless, but strong enough to bar a door, and on a handful of craft shards, the little clouded crystals in which a working could be bought ready-made and pressed into one's own weave. He took what the coin would stretch to, workings for the road and the fight to come,
chosen with Pip's hard, practical eye.
And he practiced, walking the crowded planks, the trick Pip drilled into him between errands, a way of moving that slid the eye off you, of being so unremarkable that attention simply would not stick, the knowing calling it a hush step as it took root in him, until by dusk, Vale could pass within arm's reach of a Marrowgate hireling, reading his own wanted board, and draw not a flicker. It was Pip who found them their ship, and Pip who first smelled the trap closing. He came back to their bolt hole above a fish smoker's near dark, and his grin was gone. "I've got us passage," he said. "A cog called the Tide Loom, sailing on the morning tide for Perrins Harbour in the Lytton Isles. A refugee run, half her hold full of poor souls fleeing the Cinder War in the south, which is perfect, because 2 more nobodies among 100 nobodies is exactly the crowd we want to vanish into." The mate's a decent sort, named Corwin Kyle, and he didn't ask questions when the coin was right. He sat and did not relax.
But Vale, coming back, I marked the same 3 faces twice, in different quarters of the port, all watching the ways to the outer quays. Sealed word, or working for them. They've stopped watching the whole harbour. They've started watching the ships out. The fast ones, the ones a runner would take. Which means they know we're here, or as near as makes no difference. And they've drawn a net around the one thing we need. The boarding. He met Vale's eyes steadily in the smoke dim. "We can still get you aboard, but it won't be by both of us strolling up the gangplank together. They're looking for a tall crossing and a hobbin, traveling as a pair. So the pair is the one thing we can't be when the moment comes." Something cold moved in Vale's chest. "Pip." "Not yet." The hobbin held up a hand. "Not tonight. Tonight we sleep, because you're no use exhausted, and I've a thing or two to arrange." He was already turning something over in his clever hands, a small clouded token he must have bought or lifted somewhere in the day's errands, a thing that hummed faintly of glamour, and Vale, too tired and too full of dread to ask, let him. "In the morning I'll get you to the Tide Loom," Pip said quietly, "and you'll go aboard, and you'll sail on the tide, and you'll not do anything noble to stop it. Whatever happens on that quay, promise me that much, and let me sleep." Vale looked at his friend's set face and the humming token in his hands, and understood, without being told, the shape of what was coming, and hated it, and could not stop it. "I don't like this," he said. "You're not meant to," Pip said. "Promise me anyway." They almost made it clean. In the grey of the morning tide, they came down toward the outer quays, by the back ways Pip knew, under the fish racks, along a floating raft street that swayed underfoot, through the steam and clangor of a caulker's yard, with Vale hooded and hush-stepped and forgettable, and the Tide Loom riding at her mooring at the quay's end, her gangplank down, and her deck already crowding with the ragged refugees of the Cinder War. 100 paces. 80. And then, from a gap between 2 warehouses, grey and gold stepped into the raft street ahead of them, and behind, and Vale heard Pip breathe a single filthy word, and knew the net had closed. There were 4 of them, at least, sealed word men, not knights but hunters, hard and quiet, and they had chosen their spot. A narrow swaying stretch of raft street with the sea on one side and a sheer warehouse wall on the other. No crowd to lose themselves in, no side turning to bolt down. One of the hunters was already looking straight at Vale, past the hush step, with the particular attention of a man comparing a face to a board. In a moment, he would be sure. In a moment, there would be no ship and no isles and no more running. "Ali, now!"
Pip shoved him sideways into the one crack in the wall, a rubbish-choked gap between the warehouse and its neighbor, out of the hunter's line for 2 precious heartbeats. And there, in the stinking dark, the Hobbin did the thing he had been arranging all the night before. The thing Vale had dreaded since he'd seen the humming token in his friend's hands. He worked a glamour. He pressed the clouded token to Vale's brow and spoke 3 words over it. And Vale felt the world's eye slide off him harder than any hush step, felt himself become, for a little while, unremarkable past all remark. A face the mind refused to hold, a nobody the memory would not keep.
And in the same breath, with the last of whatever the token held, Pip conjured the counterfeit that would sell it. A shape of woven light that stepped out of the alley's mouth ahead of Vale and wore, for anyone watching, the very likeness of a tall hooded crossing and a Hobbin fleeing side by side. The pair the hunters had been told to find, running the wrong way, deeper into the port, away from the ship.
"There,"
Pip said, and his sharp face in the alley's dark was fierce and steady and utterly without regret.
"That's you and me both, going the wrong way at a dead run. They'll chase it. A decoy that runs is worth a dozen that hides, and they can't afford to let the pair reach a ship, so they'll all chase it, hard, and it'll lead them a merry mile before it comes apart in their hands."
He gripped Vale's wrist, hard, once.
"You walk out of this alley alone, and nobody remembers. And you go up that gangplank, and you sail. That's the whole of it."
That's the plan working? No. Vale had known, and still it broke over him now, cold and total. No. The decoy runs, but they'll see it's a trick when it fades. They'll come back. They'll be looking for the pair. You can't stay here as one of the pair. They'll take you, Pip. He caught the shape of it fully at last, the thing his friend had built in the night. The decoy would draw the hunt off, but a decoy of woven light left no scent, no track, no captive. And a hunt that lost its quarry into thin air came back, angry, and swept the port. Unless it had something real to catch. Unless the small figure it half glimpsed, slipping the other way, drawing its eye, keeping its attention, giving it a true chase to spend its fury on, was flesh. "You're going to be the one they catch," Vale said, and his voice cracked on it. "That's the plan. That's what you arranged. The decoy for their eyes, and you for their hands, so they never once look at the gangplank." "Now you've got it." Pip's grin was the truest and most terrible thing Vale ever saw him do. "Don't look like that. I'm the slipperiest Hobbin in 3 kingdoms, and my name's already on the boards for a smaller sum than yours. They want you a great deal more than they want me, which means they'll take me and hold me and haul me off to answer questions, and questions take time, and time is a ship sailing on the tide with the one man in the world who can pull the rot from a dying woman safe in her hold." He was already backing toward the alley's mouth, toward the raft street and the waiting grey and gold, light on his feet, alive with it. "I made 2 promises, Vale. To the wicks, to keep you breathing. To you, to get you to the ship. I'm keeping both in the next 10 heartbeats, and there's not a thing you can do about it but waste them arguing." The fierceness gentled, just once, just for him. "Go and live. That's all I ever wanted for the strange, sad man who crossed over and wouldn't let his friends fall. Now watch me work, and don't you dare come after." And then Pip Cord stepped out into the raft street in plain sight, whooped once to make certain every hunter's head turned, flung the conjured pair sprinting away down the wrong road as bait, and ran after his own decoy, drawing the whole grey and gold hunt roaring after him, away from the alley, away from the quay, away from the tide loom, until the swaying planks were empty, and the only sound was the gulls and Vale's own breath tearing in his chest. He stood in the stinking dark with a glamour on his brow that no one would remember, and his friends' laughter fading toward capture. And he kept the promise, because it was the last and only thing left that he could give. He walked out of the alley alone. He crossed the empty quay, and nobody saw.
And he went up the gangplank of the tide loom, with his hood up and his heart in ruins, and did not look back. Because if he looked back, he would go after, and going after would make Pip's whole sacrifice a wasted breath. Behind him, somewhere in the maze of Heaven's Leech, the hunt closed on a small, fierce shape that had chosen this. Ahead, the deck of the refugee cog rocked under his feet, crowded with the fleeing and the frightened. Vale Marin found a shadow against the rail and stood in it, and let no one see his face, and grieved in silence for the friend he had been made to leave behind. He gave the mate a false name at the head of the gangplank, Barleyhound, the first thing that came to his broken mind, the dog's name and the port's stink stitched together. And Corwin Kyle, a lean, weathered man with a tally board and no time for curiosity, marked it down without a glance and waved him toward the refugees crowding the waist of the ship. Vale did not join them. He found instead the mate's mercy, in the form of a berth no one else wanted, a cramped triangular closet of a cabin wedged up under the forecastle, barely more than a locker with a bunk in it, dark and airless and private. And he took it gratefully and made it his own, the only way a hunted man knows how. He barred the door from within with the reinforced stave, the plain iron-shod oak he'd bought in the port for exactly this, wedged hard against the planks. And he sat in the dark with his back to the wall and his knees drawn up and, for a long while, did not move at all. Grief had a weight he had forgotten. He had lost people in his first life and thought himself an expert in it, but he had never before lost someone who had chosen to be lost for him, and the arithmetic of that was unbearable. Pip had traded himself for Vale's passage as evenly as Salawen had traded truth for the hardcore, and there was no undoing the trade and no honoring it except to survive. And surviving felt, in the airless dark, like a poor and shameful thing to do with a gift so dearly bought. He was still sitting so when the shouting on deck told him the ship was not yet as safe as he'd hoped. 2 more passengers had come up the gangplank at the last moment before the tide, and the whole of the tide loom had gone quiet and wary at the sight of them. And Vale, easing his cabin door open a crack to listen, understood why. He could see them across the crowded deck. One was an undelver, but not stone-grey and stony like Torvald. This one was red-bearded and broad as a forge, and he bore a great single-bitted axe across his back, whose head glowed, even in daylight, with a banked orange heat. A champion's weapon. A fire undelver of terrible renown. The other was slighter, stranger. A lithe, air-touched figure who did not quite seem to keep her feet on the deck, whose dark hair and loose garments stirred in a wind that touched nothing else. One of the undertow kin, a zephyr made flesh. And both of them, plain on their gear for anyone to read, wore the sign of the sealed word. Vale's blood went to ice. He eased the door shut and set the stave, and sat rigid in the dark. The order. Aboard. 2 of their marked champions, on the one ship in Heron's Reach he had bought his way onto, and he a blank that stank of the undertow, a priced breach in the wall. Had they followed him? Had Pip's sacrifice been for nothing? Had the hunt simply put its best 2 aboard to take him at sea where there was nowhere left to run? He could not know. He knew only that if they were hunting him, he was already caught. A rat in a barred locker, on a ship bound out into open water, and that his one thin hope was to become Barleyhound so completely, to stay so silent
and so unseen in his forecastle closet, that even the sealed word's champions would find nothing aboard worth the reading. So he stayed hidden. Through the calling of the crew and the groan of the capstan and the first heave of the deck beneath him, he stayed barred in the dark, and he made himself, for the first time since the marsh, take a cold, hard inventory of everything he had to fight or flee with, if it came to it. The reinforced stave against the door, the skipstone at his throat, cooled and ready, a step's worth of escape no more. The numbing touch he'd taken from the frost piper's cold that could steal the feeling from a limb. The hearth flame, the draw the rot, the lending of his own grit, the craft shards he'd pressed into himself in the port, and, cold and wrung against his wrist under his sleeve, where he never let his eye rest on it, the beguiling band, the slaver's circlet he had sworn to carry and not to use unless he stood in the way of a death. He counted it all in the dark, and found it a small hoard against 2 champions of an order that wanted him unmade, and set his back to the wall to wait out a voyage he was no longer sure he would survive. The tide loom cleared the lagoon mouth and met the open swell of the coast sea, and Heron's Reach fell away astern with Pip somewhere in it, and Vale Marin sailed out onto dark water among 100 frightened strangers and 2 feared enemies who might not be enemies at all, alone as he had never been in this world, and did not yet know that the true danger to the ship was not aboard her, but waiting, patient and hungry, beneath the moonlit sea ahead. The attack came on the 2nd night, under a moon 3 days from full, and it came from below. Vale was half dozing against his cabin wall when the ship's bell began to hammer. Not the measured strokes of a watch change, but a frantic clangor, and under it a sound he did not at first understand, a wet, slithering thud, 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 against the hull all along the waterline, as though the sea itself had grown hands and begun to climb. Then the screaming started on deck, and he was up and had the stave loose from the door before he had decided anything at all. He came out into a nightmare. They were pouring over the rails, the gaunts. A refugee near him shrieked the name. Gar-trolls, the drowning raiders of the deep coast, amphibious things the grey-green of drowned flesh, long-limbed and slick and terribly strong, hauling themselves up the ship's sides on webbed hands and coming over the gunwales in a tide. They did not fight like an enemy trying to sink a ship. They fought like hunters working a warren, and Vale's stomach turned as he understood it. They had come for the people. They swung weighted nets, casting them over knots of screaming refugees, and dragging the catch toward the rails to be hauled down into the black water. Where a net cast missed, they clubbed and seized and bound. The tide loom was not being raided, she was being harvested. Her hold of war refugees, the crop, and the gaunts moved among the helpless with the patient horror of things that had done this many times before. And into that horror stepped the 2 the whole ship had feared. The fire undelver came off the forecastle with a bellow that cut through the screaming, and the great glowing axe came off his back and into a gaunt that had a child's mother in its net. And the raider simply came apart, its net falling slack, and the champion planted himself in the thick of the boarding like a burning forge anvil, and did not give ground. "To me!" he roared, in a voice made to carry over battle din. "Behind me, all of you. Kasnar Emberdelve holds this rail, and nothing crosses it that I don't burn. Neithalu, the nets!" And the air-touched woman was already among them, laughing, actually laughing, high and wild and joyous, running along the very top of the gunwale where no footing was, spinning a long weighted rope in both hands that lashed out to foul the raiders' net arms and snap their bindings, cutting captives free faster than the gaunts could take them, her wind gusting the reek of the sea back into the raiders' faces.
They wore the sealed words sign, and they were not hunting Vale at all. They were the ship's sworn guards, protectors set aboard the refugee run to shield exactly these people from exactly this. And Vale had spent 2 nights barred in the dark in terror of the only 2 souls on the ship who would have died to defend him. He had no time to feel the shame of it.
A net whipped past his head and took the man beside him, and Vale made his choice in the space of that breath. The same choice he had made over a dying dog, over a fevered woman, over a river, and stopped hiding. He waded into the harvest as a mender wades into a wound. He could not match a gaunt for strength and did not try. He fought the way he had always fought, clever and unrelenting and impossible to finish. Where a raider had a captive netted and half over the rail, Vale laid the numbing touch on the thing's straining arm. The cold deadness he'd taken from the frost piper poured now into slick grey flesh, and the limb went slack and useless, the net cord slithering from nerveless fingers, and he hauled the captive back and cut them loose with the stave's iron heel and shoved them toward Kasnar's burning rail. Where a wounded refugee lay bleeding under the churn of feet, he was on his knees with the hearth flame before he'd finished the thought, mending faster than the battle could kill. He could not be caught quite. The skipstone flared warm at his throat again and again, snatching him a step sideways out of a closing net, out from under a descending club, always there, and then somehow there instead. And where a raider reached for a child, Vale skipped inside its guard and put numbing death into the reaching arm and dragged the child clear, and turned already toward the next. Across the reeling deck, Kasnar Emberdelve marked him, the hooded nobody who fought like no nobody, who healed and vanished and reappeared and would not let a single soul be taken while he could reach them. The champion's fierce eyes found Vale's for one instant over the carnage, and something passed between them, an old soldier's recognition. This one stands.
"Whoever you are, blank face,"
the Undelver roared, splitting another gaunt.
"You keep them breathing, and I'll keep them off you. Neithalu, the Mender! Cover the Mender!"
And the air dancer's wild laughter turned toward Vale like a blessing, and for the space of a heartbeat, the 3 of them held the whole tide of the sea at bay together. And then a gaunt he had not seen came up out of a hatchway at his back, and drove a barbed sea spear clean through him, in below the shoulder blade and out below the collarbone, and pinned Vale Marin to the mast, like a moth to a board. The world went white, and then very small, and then very clear.
There was no pain at first. The body is merciful in the first instant of a wound too large to comprehend. And Vale looked down and saw the barbed grey head of the spear standing out of his own chest below the collarbone, wet and dark, and understood in a distant, clinical way that it had gone through his lung, that he was pinned upright against the mast by a shaft as thick as his wrist, that this was the kind of wound that a mender in his first life would have seen and known there was nothing to be done, nothing at all, only the holding of a hand while it finished.
Then the pain arrived, and with it the drowning, his own blood filling the lung the spear had opened, so that his next breath came as a wet, tearing bubble and brought no air with it. And behind him, the gaunt that had impaled him set its webbed feet against the deck and hauled on the shaft to work him loose and finish him, dragging the barbs against the inside of his chest. And Vale Marin began, methodically, in agony, to save his own life. He could not pull the spear. Pinned as he was, one arm useless, drowning, he had no strength for it and no leverage. But he did not need to pull the spear to mend. He turned the hearth flame inward, all of it, everything. The whole of his calling poured not outward into another, but down into the ruin of his own chest. And where the barbed iron had opened his lung, he closed it around the shaft, sealing the torn vessels,
knitting the drowned tissue, forcing his own flesh to live in defiance of the thing killing it.
The knowing had a name for it that he grasped only now, doing it, at the edge of death. Self-mender. The healer's last and hardest art, the mending of the mending hand itself. He drowned and healed, and drowned and healed in the same breath. A body dying and refusing to die at the same instant, and it should not have been survivable, and he survived it. Because he had crossed into this world on a refusal, and the refusal had never once left him. The gaunt hauled harder. The barbs tore, and Vale, pinned and drowning and self-mending, with his one working arm and no plan, and a desperate, half-mad clarity, reached out with a lesser craft than he had ever thought to use in a killing fight. A helping hand. A foolish little working meant for holding a bandage or steadying a cup. A phantom hand of force he could send a little way from himself, and jabbed it, hard, into the raider's eye. It was absurd. It was the poke of a spectral finger, but a finger in the eye is a finger in the eye to any creature that has eyes. And the gaunt flinched and lost its grip on the shaft for 1/2 second, and 1/2 second was all Vale's ally needed. Nithalu came out of the dark and the wind like a thrown blade. She had seen him fall. Her wild laughter had gone silent the instant the spear went home, and she had crossed the length of the raging deck along the tops of the gunwales in the time it took the gaunt to set its feet. And now she dropped on the raider from above with her weighted rope snapping taut around its throat and all her air-touched weight behind it. The gaunt was torn away from Vale and from the spear and hurled bodily over the rail into the black sea it had climbed out of, and Nithalu landed light as a leaf beside the pinned and bleeding mender, and her strange, laughing joy came flooding back into her face at the sight of him still conscious, still alive.
"You live!" she cried, delighted, as though he had performed a marvelous trick expressly for her pleasure.
"Impaled and drowning, and you mend yourself. Oh, you wonderful, strange, broken thing, hold still, hold still."
And with a strength that wind should not have had, bracing one bare foot against the mast, she gripped the spear shaft and drew it out of him in one long, smooth pull, while Vale's own hearth flame raced the withdrawal, sealing the channel behind the barbs even as they came free, so that the terrible wound closed almost as fast as the iron left it, and Vale sagged off the mast into her waiting arm, still bleeding, still ruined, but no longer pinned, no longer drowning, alive against every law of the world he had lived and died under before. "Up," Nithalu breathed, hauling him to his feet, her wild eyes shining. "Up, Mender. They're still coming, and Kasnar can't hold the whole rail alone. Can you stand? Can you fight?" "Say you can fight. I have never in 100 years seen anyone I so wanted at my back." Vale got his feet under him. His chest was a single vast ache, the self-mended lung a raw and shrieking thing, his wellspring alarmingly low. But he was standing. He had been run through the heart of himself, and he was standing. And around him, 100 frightened souls were still being harvested by the sea, and he was the only mender on a ship full of the wounded and the dying. He looked at the barbed spear in Nithalu's hand, and at the reeling deck, and at Kasnar's burning rail holding against the tide. He put one bloody hand to the cold, wrong circlet under his sleeve, the thing he had sworn to carry and not to use unless he stood in the way of a death. He was standing in the way of 100 of them. "I can fight," Vale said, and his voice came out ragged but sure.
"Get me to the worst of it."
The worst of it was amidships, where the gaunts had broken through in numbers, and a knot of the fiercest raiders was working a great net over a dozen packed refugees at once, and no amount of Kasnar's fire nor Neithalu's rope could reach them before the whole catch went over the side. Vale reached the cold circlet on his wrist and turned his eye at last full upon it, and drew it out and put it on. He had sworn not to. He had told Pip that if he ever used the thing easily, his friend could throw it in the sea off his corpse. There was nothing easy in this. It cost him to do it what it had cost the borrower to take Ironwit. A wrenching revulsion, a violation of his own held line. And he did it anyway, because Mother Salowen had been right by her green fire, and the day she had promised had come. The day the only thing standing between people he could not let die and a killing tide was his willingness to reach into an enemy's head for one breath and make it his. He fixed on the largest of the gaunts at the net, a scarred brute of a raider directing the others, and through the beguiling band he reached, and the terrible whisper of the fey thread went out of him and into the thing's slick grey skull. And for one breath, the gaunt was not its own. It was Vale's. He did not make it drop the net. He made it turn. He set the raider's own great strength against the raiders beside it, and the scarred gaunt fell upon its own kind with the barbed ferocity it had meant for the refugees, tearing net cords, hurling its fellows from the rail, sowing a sudden shrieking chaos in the very heart of the boarding, where an instant before there had been remorseless order. The packed catch of refugees, their net rent by their own captor, scrambled free and away toward Kasnar's rail. And the gaunts, who had climbed out of the sea to hunt frightened prey, who had never once in this raid met a thing that fought back from inside their own ranks, broke. It is a small thing that turns a battle, and it is always the same small thing. The moment the hunters realize they have become the hunted. Kasnar felt it, and roared, and pressed forward off his rail at last, the burning axe carving a widening space. Neithalu felt it, and her wild laughter rang out again over the deck as she danced along the gunwales, cutting free the last of the netted. And in the churning center of it, a single commanded gaunt tore into its own kind, while Vale Marin stood swaying and bleeding, with a slaver's circlet on his brow, and grief and resolve in equal measure carved into his face, spending a power he loathed to buy the lives of strangers, exactly as he had been told he one day would. The tide had turned, but turning was not winning, and the deck was full of the wounded he had bought that turning with, and Vale let the commanded gaunt fall the instant its work was done, released its mind, let it drop. Let the battle fury of the defenders finish what the confusion had begun, because he had 100 hurts to tend and a fading wellspring to tend them with, and he had never in either of his lives cared less about winning a fight than about who was still breathing at the end of it. "Emberdelve!" he called, hoarse, hauling the band from his brow and thrusting it away out of sight, unable to bear the feel of it a moment past its need. "Neithalu! Drive them. Break them. I'll hold the wounded. Bring me anyone who's still breathing, and I'll keep them breathing." And Kasnar Emberdelve, wading through the last of the raiders, threw back his red-bearded head and laughed like a man who has found, in the middle of a slaughter, exactly the ally he had prayed for. "You heard the mender!" he bellowed to the crew, to the sailors, to the whole reeling ship. "Bring him your hurt! We break these drowning devils, and the blank-faced healer keeps our people alive. Drive them back to the sea!" The defenders surged, and Vale turned from the breaking of the raid to the mending of its cost, and began the last and truest work of that terrible night. What Vale did in the last hour of that night, the crew of the Tideloom would tell of for the rest of their lives, in every port from the Saltweft to the Lytton Isles, and the telling never did it justice, because there is no way to make a listener feel the thing itself. A man with a hole through his chest, moving from body to body, across a blood-slick deck under a near full moon. refusing to let a single soul die while he had breath and wellspring to spend. Long past the point where his own body begged him to stop, he did not stop. They brought them to him, and he mended them. A sailor with his belly opened. Vale's hands in the wound, the hearth flame racing, the man's own guts knitting back to wholeness under a light that was not hot. A refugee mother clubbed near to death, Vale drawing the swelling from her skull, coaxing the crushed thing beneath to live. A boy no older than Corin with a barbed dart through his thigh, screaming, and Vale numbing the leg with the frost piper's cold, so the child felt nothing while the iron came free and the flesh closed. He used the skipstone now not to escape, but to reach, flaring warm at his throat again and again, to blink him across the wreckage of the deck to the next fallen body, an instant faster, a step nearer, because a step might be a life. He skipped from the forecastle to the waist to the stern rail and back, appearing at each dying man's side as though the ship itself were folding to bring him where he was needed, until the crew swore the blank-faced mender could be in two places at once, until the tide loom had a saint's tale about it before the night was even over. And it was killing him. He knew it and did not care. Each mending drew from a wellspring already emptied by his own self-healing. Each working drank deeper from a well nearer and nearer to dry, and past the water came the drawing on his own life, his own flesh, his own thread. The mender spending himself as fuel because there was nothing else left to spend. His self-mended lung tore at him with every breath. His broken and re-broken ribs ground. His vision narrowed and swam. He kept his feet by mending himself just enough to keep them, over and over, a man out-healing his own collapse by inches. And he poured everything that brought him straight into the next stranger's wound. Somewhere in it, Kalzash found him, a beastkin sailor, soft-furred and grey, one of Corwin Kyle's crew, and made himself Vale's shadow, half carrying him from body to body when Vale's legs began to fail, holding him upright over the wounded so his emptying hands could still work, murmuring in a low, rough purr, "Easy, healer, easy. There's another one here. Just one more. You've got one more in you." And Vale, past speech now, past everything but the one refusal that had made him and carried him across two worlds, always had one more in him. He understood, dimly, in the deep place where a man is most honest, why he could not stop. It was not the calling. It was older than the calling. It was every white room of his first life, every hand he had held while it went cold because holding was all he could do. It was a wife and a child he had not been able to save with any amount of wanting. It was a lifetime of standing helpless at the edge of other people's dying, with his own hands tied. He had been given, at the very end of everything, hands that could do what all that wanting never could. And he would sooner empty himself to the last drop than ever again stand at a deathbed and be able to do nothing. So he mended and would not stop, and the ones he reached lived. The skipstone ran dry between one blink and the next, its warmth guttering out cold and spent against his throat. And after that, he crawled. He crawled to the wounded on his hands and knees with Kalzash beside him, and a mana-charm one of the crew pressed into his hand gave him one last thin flush of wellspring, and he spent that too, all of it, on a dying man he had not yet reached. And then there was nothing left in the charm, and nothing left in the stone, and nothing left in the well, and very nearly nothing left in Vale Marin. Above the ship, the last gaunts were going over the rail and down into the sea they had come from. Kasnar's fire, and Nithalu's rope, and the broken raider's own terror driving them back to the deep. and the harvest was ended. And the tide loom was saved, and up and down her ruined deck, the wounded, who should by every law have died, were breathing. Every one that Vale had been able to reach, kept alive by a hand that had at last given everything it had. He mended the last one he could reach. He felt the man's breath steady under his palms. And then Vale Marin had nothing more to give at all. The cost came for him all at once, the way a debt long outrun finally overtakes the runner. He had held his own collapse at bay for an hour by mending himself in stolen instants, out-healing the ruin of his body one breath at a time, so he could go on tending others. And now there was no wellspring left to mend with, and the whole of it fell due together. The self-mended lung, held closed by a working that had finally failed, filled again with a slow, drowning weight. The broken ribs, forgotten in the fury of the night, woke and screamed. Every hurt he had numbed and ignored and postponed came flooding back into a body with nothing left to hold them off. A storm of afflictions breaking over him all at once. The drowning, the grinding, the deep grey emptiness of a thread drawn down almost to nothing. The world going soft and dark at its edges. Vale swayed on his knees over the last man he had saved, and could not get up, and knew, distantly, that he had spent himself past the line from which people do not always come back. He found that he was not afraid. He had done it. That was the whole of what remained to him, there at the end of his strength on the blood-washed deck under the sinking moon. He had done it. The ship was saved. The sea's harvest was ended. Everyone he had been able to reach was breathing. The sailor with the opened belly, the clubbed mother, the boy with the pierced thigh, all of them, drawing air on a deck that should have been a slaughter yard. He had crossed into this world on a refusal to let one chosen soul be handed to him, insisting he would earn every mending himself. And he had earned 100 of them in a single night, at the cost of very nearly his own life. And if this was where the count of his second thread ran out, then it ran out having spent itself on exactly the thing he had asked for. His arms gave way. He began to fall. He did not strike the deck. Kalzash caught him, the grey beastkin sailor who had been his shadow through the last of it, who now gathered the failing mender up out of his own blood and cradled him against a soft-furred chest, as easily as a man cradles a spent child. And Vale felt himself held, and heard the sailor's low, rough purr close to his ear. "I've got you, healer. I've got you. It's done. You did it. They're all breathing. Every one you touched. You hear me? Rest now. You're allowed to rest now." Above him, the ruined deck swam and tilted. He was aware of faces gathering. Kaznar's fierce, red-bearded one. Nitalu's wild, grieving, joyous one. Corwin Kyle's weathered one. And behind them a crowd of the frightened and the saved. The refugees of the Cinder War who had boarded this ship to flee one horror and had nearly met a worse. All of them looking down now at the blank-faced stranger who had bled from a hole in his chest and would not stop mending them. Someone was weeping. Someone was saying his false name, Barley Hound, Barley Hound. And someone else, one of the crew who had seen the whole of it, was already saying it wasn't a name at all, that a man who did that had a truer one, and that they'd have it out of him when he woke, if he woke. Vale's eyes found Nithalu's, and he tried to smile, and could not quite manage it. And she pressed her strange, cool hand to his brow, the way one gentles a horse. He thought of Pip, somewhere far behind him in heaven's reach, who had spent himself so that Vale could be here to spend himself. And it seemed to him, fading, that the two of them had done the same thing on the same night in different ways, and that there was a rightness in it that he could not hold on to long enough to name. He thought of the wicks, and of Maida breathing easy in a bed she should have died in, and Corin with both arms around a dog that should have died in the brambles. He thought, strangely, at the very last, of the birds crossing the window of a white room in a world he had left behind, and of how badly he had once wanted only to walk out under the sky and feel the cold air fill lungs that worked. His lungs were failing again now, but he had walked a very long way under a very great deal of sky to get to this deck, on his own 2 feet, and had filled these borrowed lungs with the cold sea air of a world that had wanted him dead, and that he had, against everything, made a place in. The storm of afflictions closed over him like the black water of the Andy Wash, and Vale Marin let it take him down into the dark, cradled and safe. The raid ended, the ship saved, the wounded alive, and knew nothing more. He woke to daylight, and the creak of a ship running before a steady wind, and the astonishing fact of being alive. He was in his own cramped forecastle cabin, or someone had carried him to it. The reinforced stave stood in the corner, no longer barring anything, and the little triangular space had been made as kind as such a space could be, with a folded cloak beneath his head and water at his hand, and the grey light of a clear morning coming down through the open hatch above. His chest, when he made himself breathe deep to test it, held. It ached with a deep, bruised ache that would be weeks in leaving, and his whole body had the wrung-out lightness of a thread drawn nearly to its end, and slowly, filling again. But it held. He had spent himself past the line, and come back from it, and the coming back was its own quiet miracle, one more mending in a life that had become nothing but. Neithalu was sitting in the hatchway with her feet on the ladder, watching him, and when his eyes opened, her wild face broke into that joyous grin.
"There you are," she said. "2 days you slept. Kasnar said you'd die, and I said you wouldn't, because a man who mends himself with a spear through his lung does not have the good manners to die of tiredness afterward. And I was right. And now he owes me his second-best axe."
She leaned in, all delight.
"They know, by the way."
"Not the whole of it. Not the order's paper. We've kept that quiet, Kasna and I. Because whatever the sealed word wants you for, you are plainly not the thing they think you are. And a champion of the order gets to decide such things for himself, now and then." Her grin sharpened, fond and fierce. "But they know you're no barley hound. The whole ship knows what you did. You'll not have a moment's peace, nor pay for a drink again in your life, Mender. And it serves you right." Vale lay still and let it settle over him, that he was alive and known, and among people who would guard rather than hunt him. He did not have everything. He turned that over, honestly, in the grey morning light. Pip was somewhere behind him in Herrenswich, taken or fled, his fate an open wound Vale could not close and would not stop feeling. He made himself a promise, there in the cabin, that if he lived to reach the Isles and heal, he would come back one day and find out, and settle the debt, or mourn it. The wicks were safe, but forever watched now on his account. Maida breathing on borrowed years he had bought her, at the price of their peace. Sir Groft still hunted, and the order behind him, and the sealing mark still lay cold on the back of his neck, with its promise or its doom unread. A mark set, Halgra had said, only where the world meant to make a hinge of a life. Somewhere south, the Cinder War still burned, sending its refugees north across the very sea he sailed. None of it was finished. His story had not been resolved, so much as begun, the way a life is begun, with a great deal still dark ahead, and no promise of how any of it would fall. But he had this. He lay in a ship bound for the free Lytton Isles, where the orders writ did not run, cared for by an air dancer and a fire champion who had fought at his back, borne up by a crew who had watched a dying man refuse to let them die, and would not forget it. He had a calling he had once dreaded, and now understood to be the truest thing about him. Not the sick-room station he had feared, not helplessness with the roles reversed, but its opposite. The power, at last, to do something at the edge of other people's dying, besides hold their hands. He had come into this world a man who could do nothing, and had become a man who had nearly killed himself doing everything. And he found, testing the shape of who he now was against who he had been, that he was at peace with it. More than at peace. He would not have traded the hole in his chest for anything, because of the 100 breaths still moving on the deck above his head. He got up, slowly, with Neithalu's cool hand under his arm, and climbed the ladder into the light. The tide loom ran south and west across a bright morning sea, her mended sails full, the water breaking blue and white at her bow. Kasnar was at the rail with his glowing axe across his back, and raised a great red-bearded grin at the sight of Vale on his feet. The saved were everywhere about the deck, mending in the sun, and they turned toward him as he came up, one and then another, and then all of them, in a silence that was fuller than any cheer. Somewhere ahead, still below the horizon, lay the free isles and refuge, and the next unwritten stretch of a life he had twice now refused to give up. Behind him lay a friend he would go back for, a family he would not forget, an order that would not forget him, and a war and a destiny still waiting their turn. Vale Marin stood at the rail of the ship he had saved, with the cold, clean sea air filling lungs that worked, whole and hunted and alive, and looked out at the open horizon and was, for the first time since a white room in a world that was gone, entirely content to see what came next.